I've managed to. I won't bore you with why I'm here and how I'm here. But anyway, it's not where I live. It's where I managed to get a room to do the to do this kind of broadcast or narrowcast, I guess we call it. Yeah.
So, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, in which, looking to the year ahead, and indeed way beyond, we'll be asking how we can remake Britain with our special guest, Will Hutton. In so doing, we'll seek to identify the kinds of narrative, philosophy, and programs of action that might be capable of driving a national renewal in such an increasingly troubled world, as well as exploring the kind of national conversation that we might need to get there, and the part that a more purposeful capitalism, more purposeful businesses, and indeed more purposeful marketing might play in bringing that to life. In so doing, we could hardly be in better company because, as well as being the former editor-in-chief and still a regular columnist at the Observer newspaper and former economics editor of the BBC's Newsnight and of the Guardian newspaper, Will is co-chair of the Purposeful Company think tank, which happens to involve a former MarketingKind exchange guest, Alex Edmonds, on its steering committee, and has written 6 powerful books, the most recent of which is a direct hit for this evening's conversation, and is called This Time No Mistakes, How to Remake Britain. And of particular interest to us, of course, among many other things, Will chaired a government commission into the future of the creative industries. There is often also a personal dimension to our exchanges. And I first became something of a fan of Will's quite some time ago when I was studying A-level economics. And Will's writing first kindled my interest in the thinking of John Maynard Keynes, and also inspired me to see the value of challenging assumptions, which I believe is a habit that has very much stayed with me to the present day. As it happens, I did not go on to study economics after A-level at university, and this was partly because I overheard a professor at the LSE say that he would rather have receive applications from candidates who'd studied A-level maths than A-level economics. And I became concerned that an overly reductive focus on the numbers at the expense of the stories that might make sense of those numbers could be more a source of economic problems than economic solutions. But today is hopefully our chance to put that right as we talk with one of our leading economics commentators through the lens of how we can put the economy back inside a bigger story of meaning and purpose that might be capable of making us more successful in the first place. In my view, putting the horses properly back in front of the cart. So welcome to MarketingKind, Will. How are you feeling this evening?
Well, I'm feeling very good, but slightly stressed the temperamental nature of the internet here. But anyway, Wi-Fi, I should say. But let's go. I'm looking forward to it. Let's go.
Well, we are very grateful to have you with us, and we shall collectively triumph over any technological obstacles. Um, Now, before we dive directly into the book, um, shortly before the general election, Sir Keir Starmer, of course, came to your book launch, spoke at your book launch, and endorsed the book, but quite specifically made a comment that really stayed with me. He said that he felt under tremendous pressure personally to live up to the ideas in the book. Now, to remind everyone, it's called This Time No Mistakes. He's had a little over half a year in government. What would be your assessment so far as to the degree to which he's showing himself able to live up to those ideas?
Well, it's now obvious. I mean, it was obvious when I wrote the book, and I did spell it out, that 14 years of kind of misgovernance and the result of kind of epic mistakes in policy, starting with Mrs. Thatcher's monetarism back in the 1980s, but following through with the financial crisis, Brexit, and the Liz Truss budget, had left Britain in a really, really bad place. And it was going to require, considerable kind of political statecraft and economic vision to get out of it. Um, you know, and I think I do kind of forgive um, the party and the government in one way, but another way, I'm critical. And I forgive them because people forget how very near to breaking the Labour Party was in the summer of 2019 when Tom Watson, the then deputy leader, was about to lead 80 Labour MPs out of the Labour Party to form another party. And Corbyn, and it then had this disastrous result in the 2019 general election. And when parties go through new death experiences like that, they don't have very much self-confidence or intellectual confidence or ideological confidence. And that I think is, and even kind of, it's hard to remember, but it was in the July 21 by-election at also Batley and Spence, which Labour won by 320 votes. Had he lost that, he would have had resolved to resign. And so to jump from that into being kind of self-confident, kind of economic and political statesman, and to kind of develop a narrative that would both be recognize the depth of the problems that we're in, and actually a kind of indicative kind of framework for how to get out of it, was asking a lot. And actually, I don't think brutally that far from there being this time no mistakes, there's been two or three kind of correctable mistakes, but have actually, I'm very concerned at the financial markets at the moment, and actually the weather and the impact of a government that's made a few mistakes interacting with the quite toxic stuff coming out of the United States with Trump and Musk. The fact that British bond yields and American bond yields move in sync, and the Americans are shooting for 5%, which means that our bonds have to yield a bit more than that, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, and that's where they're going. And that's higher than they were in the great trust sell-off. So, I mean, they should have leveled with the British public before the election about the need for tax increases. They should never have accepted the March budget by Jeremy Hunt cutting national insurance contributions by a further 2%. They should have been much more quick off the mark with kind of the framework they wanted to kind of organize policy in the next, in the years ahead, leaving kind of details to be filled in kind of in 2025 instead of that terrible interregnum. And that interregnum was full of stories about, accepting freebies and money for glasses and all the rest of it. So the government is really on the back foot, and it lacks a really kind of compelling narrative. Keir is not a great storyteller or narrative spinner, or particularly intellectually curious in the way that Tony Blair was. And trying to develop a growth narrative out of this when he deputes everything to Rachel Reeves and acknowledges that he doesn't know much about it apart from the kind of broad brush stuff, is, I think, another problem. And a number of members of the cabinet are good, or fairly good, but we need them to be excellent, and we need them to be bound together by an overriding kind of story about what kind of society and economy Labour want to build and how to do it. And I'm very fearful that the plans to build 1.5 million houses, most of whom are going to be only 8% of which are designated, by the way, for people on average or low incomes, is not enough actually to get growth. So here I am in the second week of January. I don't like developments on the right. I don't like this morning's Financial Times story that Elon Musk is actively considering how to kind of undermine the Keir government and have an election before 2029. And it's extraordinary that a man that rich should take this degree of interest in our affairs with so little defence between his interest and how it might play out on the ground. It's amazing. And Trump could say, and has chosen not to, um, that he disavows all this, but he hasn't done that. So you have, this man, the President of the United States of America's closest confidant, uh, laughingly called co-president Musk, is running a vile campaign against the Starmer government at the same time as the earth tremors of the worldwide sell-off in bonds is hitting Britain most acutely. I mean, it's a very bad place to be, and the government is palsied. It won't sign up along with the French and Germans about the illegitimacy of trying to sequester Greenland. I thought its silence on this is very telling. It won't take measures to limit the impact of foreign money on the British electoral process over and above what there already is. I think it's an unfortunate appointment, someone as political as Lord Mandelson, to be ambassador to the United States. It should have been a career politician who could have had some distance between, could have acted as an honest broker between the government and Trump. I really don't like what I see. Underneath all that, there is the possibility for better. And so my assessment, I'm afraid, is downbeat. Some things have been gone right in the first 6 months, and I do think the creation of wealth fund is a good idea. I like the idea of GB Energy. I would have found the 40 billion more carefully than she did. I would have had a story to encourage business and to talk growth. I think the economy has been talked down too much. And then, I mean, Labour people, and I think not only Labour people, but the broad centre of the British electorate, want to see, the beginnings at least of substantive change in kind of the extremely low quality public services that we have, and actually, the exigencies of day-to-day life, which are very, very tough for many millions. And so far, nothing's happened, or too little has happened. So, I mean, we live in a social media age, and we want instantaneous results. The election was months earlier than they anticipated, and they hadn't got, moving from near despair to the kind of extraordinary position of having 412 MPs in the House of Commons in 2.5 years. I mean, it's an amazing transformation. And we have to hope, I have to hope, it's in nobody's interest that this government fails, that actually this next 12 months they get their line and length better than they have done the last 6 months. A long answer, I'm sorry.
Well, it sort of reminds me of the prelude of an opera that just rehearses so many of the themes that you can dive into and gives you an immediate sense of them and engagement with them. You've identified some pretty big obstacles. The whole sort of tide of political change in the world might be against us in some ways. There isn't the apparent level of competence, of confidence, and narrative competence in the government, and the cost of borrowing is now higher than at any point before New Labour. Let's turn to some of the ingredients in the book that might still be a valuable corrective, and that we might turn to rescue ourselves from this context. Now, central to the book, running through it, like the sort of lettering in the stick of a Blackpool rock, is the notion of rebalancing individualism and collectivism. You talk about notions of fellowship, and ultimately this becomes referred to as the we society, which is also the name of your podcast. So what do you mean by the we society?
Well, I do think, I mean, you've you've uncovered kind of a lot of my thinking in that question. I don't think a good society is one that's wholly built around kind of appeals to individualism, self-interest, self-aggrandizement, a me society, but equally one which is which doesn't allow for the kind of pluralism of capitalism, lots of runners and riders, essential freedoms, and a capacity to kind of live a life that you have reason to value. You have to find a kind of balance between these tensions. And what I've just outlined and what I've tried to outline in the book is that actually progressive thinkers, really from Adam Smith onward, and I count him as a progressive thinker, have actually tried to find this balance. And you can call the we an ethic of fellowship or an ethic of the social or an ethic of socialism, and that's I think that's mutuality, collaboration, cooperation, having each other's backs. But alongside that, there was a kind of development in liberal thinking towards the end of the 19th century called new liberalism, which actually, whilst kind of respecting kind of the need for, kind of individual freedoms, made the important point that individuals have obligations to the whole, and reciprocally, the whole has obligations to individual. And so kind of binding those two traditions together, the kind of ethic of socialism or fellowship and that new liberal tradition, you get to a kind of a balance between both wanting a society in which there is a social floor below which no one can fall. And it's a social floor that's not only income, it's about housing, education, training, public transport, kind of the whole basket of things that actually kind of we need as citizens to be able to operate. And actually ladder's opportunity upwards, so floor and ladder. And all of that housed, not in a kind of free-for-all kind of market's always going to be right capitalism, but a much more careful capitalism, which you try as far as you can to build into its DNA a propensity to deliver common good outcomes, and is proactively managed and with guide rails by a kind of agile state, which has an iterative and democratic relationship with its citizens. And I think obviously there's a kind of left-right perspective in that, but I think that basic framework is one that would command the kind of fealty or loyalty of the bulk of the British and indeed many other, I think, electorates in Western industrialized democracies. Cradle, ladder, common good capitalism, and an agile, iterative state. It seems to be kind of four pillars on which to build a good society, a good economy. And that's how I characterize the we society. And I was struck actually in the writing of the book, as I that actually that was exactly what Tony Blair tried to do with his kind of rewritten Clause 4 in the Labour Party's constitution, where it simultaneously says in that constitution, we all do better if we hang together and work for common good outcomes, but individuals have responsibility to the whole and the whole to individuals. It's kind of trying to capture that. Tony Blair didn't live it out when he was in office particularly, but I do think there or kind of thereabouts lies a feasible ideology, which allows you to do a lot of things that need to happen in Britain. It allows you to address the criminal kind of food banks, what's happening, the way we kind of think about families and children, what's happening in the education and training system. And equally, I think it allows you to start thinking about what the ecosystem would be that would allow Britain to grow some really kind of consequential growth companies out of the many brilliant entrepreneurs there are in Britain. It falls out that Britain has more unicorns. That's companies that have grown to kind of $1 billion in size in the recent past. We have more per million population than any country on earth, including the United States and China. So the idea we're not entrepreneurial is kind of basket is bonkers. But there's not there's not an ideology on the right or the left which kind of permits one to kind of both acknowledge this and do something about it. Kind of the left don't really want to acknowledge, there's this tremendous kind of number of kind of wannabe entrepreneurs and brilliant kind of achievers of brilliant companies. At the same time, the right think the only thing that's important is kind of deregulation and tax cuts and a small state, when actually they themselves would be the first to acknowledge. None of the heads of these companies I've spoken to actually buy into, kind of small state, kind of the notion that concerns with inclusion and diversity are woke, indulging harassment. None of that would they go in for. Nor are they particular believers in low taxation and kind of minimal government kind of proactive structures. I mean, they do get it that an ecosystem that supports them is very valuable. So you have a kind of we don't have a national conversation which permits us to kind of do the things that are needed to construct a healthier society and actually you can't build a growth economy, which we all want for the tax revenues it produces and all the rest of it, without a cohort of consequential growth companies. It's like Hamlet without the prince. And I do try to sketch out in the book and in work I've been doing at the moment for the Purposeful Company, a liberal business think tank I co-chair, to sketch out how that could be done. So look, the we society, I've tried to kind of give you a sense of its breadth and how it's simultaneously how a strong economy and a strong society are interdependent, how too much me has got us into a lot of trouble, I think, over the last 45 years, and actually getting the balance right between kind of excessive individualism and kind of excessive collectivism kind of is the sweet spot. And, I know a lot of other people have tried to say that over the years. I'm saying it today.
Well, I remember the Tony Blair's rewriting of Clause 4, and you're right that what he came up with was a beautiful piece of writing. I mean, I guess in a sense he was marking a contrast with the notion of common ownership, and so saying I'm about something new, and maybe as a sort of template for a program of action, it wasn't taken seriously enough and could have led to something more exciting. You also show something that's hiding in plain sight, that on the one hand, we've had a lot of conservative governments over the past many decades, and that actually, if you added together the votes of the Labour Party and now the Lib Dems, you actually could have had a different set of results for some time. Um, on the notion specifically of individualism and collectivism, typically we think of businesses serving our individual needs, whether in terms of the products and services we buy, the jobs we might take on, if we're in a position to where we might invest, and that government makes sure that we're collectively okay by plugging the gaps that get missed by that. And we can be a little bit cautious about too close a relationship between those two. On the one hand, business thinks that government can meddle, interfere, and distort outcomes. On the other hand, in the public, when business tries to get close to government, we can think, well, this is going to be all about lobbying for vested interest, rather than actually trying to get a publicly beneficial set of outcomes. How should the relationship between business and government change as part of this notion of a we society and rebalancing individualism and collectivism?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I've only yesterday I was learning about how some of the government's important proposed reforms on pension fund consolidation, on trying to get British pension funds thus consolidated to invest more in British kind of unquoted and quoted securities, how relaxing some of the maybe overly prescriptive kind of rules on capital that both insurance companies and banks have to have what they do has been kind of opposed by a couple of very influential financial institutions that have kind of bent the government's ear and actually kind of led to the whole thing being watered down or obstructed. And actually, what a great part of the city wanted was the government to hold its nerve and not actually surrender to what was palpably, obviously self-interesting lobbying. So there is again, you ask, what to do about that? First of all, I think that I'm this liberal business think tank I co-chair is called the Purposeful Company, and we've been promoting for a decade now the notion that if companies really embed a purpose in the sense of a mission, not kind of soft box ticking exercise in which you're kind of it's very performative and you're virtue signaling in your purpose statement, but a really grounded mission statement. We have a business model that addresses real life kind of economic and social problems, that's going to give us a recurrent income stream if we can get the product or service right. And that's our mission to do that. And we're driven by that. It imbues our values. It sets our strategy, and actually permits us to get shareholders who kind of align with that. And if you have purpose-driven companies of that type, they are more likely to kind of work with a public interest government than those who are only trying to promote shareholder value. Because in the two examples I gave, the company in the influential company I won't name that did this abstraction was actively trying to promote kind of its own, I mean, literally its own backyard, and kind of a privileged position it thought it had, which it didn't want others to compete with it on. And actually, that's shareholder value kind of prioritizing common good outcomes. So part of it is about kind of embedding that in the DNA of our companies more than it currently exists. And the great news is that in the private markets, a lot of these venture-backed scale-ups and rapidly growing startups are very mission-driven, and they do have kind of small coterie of kind of blockholder kind of shareholders who share that mission. And the trick to pull, I think, in the next 20, 25 years is to ensure that, before they get acquired, many by Americans, that they can grow via IPO. To your question, well, I've done my best.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've covered some incredibly interesting ground, and you've used the phrase several times of a national conversation. And I wonder how we can have a national conversation that addresses some of these challenges. I mean, we've had, as you've alluded to, an extraordinary few days. Apple Intelligence somehow suggesting that the BBC have revealed Rafael Nadal coming out as gay, which is a completely hallucinated story.
Yeah.
We've had Mark Zuckerberg saying that he will end fact-checking in Facebook in North America as a part of an exciting cultural renewal. We've had Elon Musk interfering extensively, making some outrageous accusations as he is about to take up a formal government position running the Department for Government Efficiency in the new Trump administration in a few days' time. How you write in the book actually that we need the national conversation is not defined by how to improve everyday lives, the performance of the economy, and the fairness of our society. How are we going to get a more restorative, healthy national conversation that can correct some of the problems that we face when we have businesses making more money out of algorithms that divide us than algorithms that bridge us, when we have artificial intelligence making it quicker and cheaper and more relentless than ever to spread misinformation, and that is in the hands of negative actors, from the extreme wealthy to hostile states to terrorist groups. And when we have a media and political environment that seems to lack the will, the ability, or even often the incentive to really correct and restore a healthy national conversation. What are some of the things that we can do to somehow get a purchase on that and try to salvage that situation?
Well, I mean, I am. Uh, there's half a dozen things I advocate in the book, in which if I was writing it now, I would actually kind of, I think I'd reinforce their message. I mean, in the book, I argue that even when kind of Facebook was being moderated, and there was a modicum of kind of same going on at X, that actually it was the falsehood was going around the world kind of instantaneously, and correction and information was doing extraordinarily, kind of was just being drowned out by it. Consequently, I made a case for all companies to be, I mean, to get to in this space to declare they're in the business of creating public benefit. Um, and I think that there should be annual audits of how they deploy artificial intelligence and construct their algorithms and how they've behaved on social media sites or social media platforms that they run. I actually also think that it's not enough to kind of flee X and go on Blue Sky, which a lot of my liberal colleagues are telling me they're going to do. I mean, I argue that we need a kind of a citizens kind of social media platform or platforms, kind of organized very similarly to the BBC, but for the 21st century. Should autonomous it may require a degree of a kind of small license fee to be paid by all of us, £5, £10, £15, to get on the digital platform that are so created. So you take away kind of advertising and the kind of incentive for kind of robots and all the rest. So I mean, a public digital platform. Um, my colleague Professor Diane Coyle at the Bennett School of Government in Cambridge University has argued for this, and I think she's right. There's always pushback. Oh, well, the market should do it. That means you have the state censoring. I think the state censors the BBC, and actually, if the opposite is the kind of, in the name of free speech, things being said and retweeted by tens of millions of people, as in the Elon Musk kind of tweets, which are really kind of, this is a kind of sewer. You turn the public space into a sewer of extraordinary kind of comments, which actually it's no fun to be reading it, and it's certainly no fun to be the object of it. And actually, previous civilizations have developed, codes of conduct and libel laws and all the rest of it to kind of, inhibit free speech, turning into a kind of a license for slander. And so, that has to be, we have to have the similar rules that we had in the analog world have to be applied in the digital world. We have to have a social media which is regularly audited for the way it uses algorithms by public independent auditors. And of course, there should be moderators. That should be a kind of precondition for trading. I mean, if X wants to be kind of deployed in the UK, then it has to have moderators, and that has to be the law of the land. So there's that. But getting a national conversation also requires, and I also think there's. I mean, I'm part of a steering group for a nascent institution which is a bit like the climate change panel. It's a kind of misinformation panel, and what we're trying to do is to take kind of particular countries, where there being kind of particularly egregious examples of abuse, and try and find ways to kind of working with the public authorities or NGOs in those countries to try and get to a better place. So there is the beginnings of a kind of civil society and international fight back, but it's slow going. So the precondition for honest conversation is actually, you can't get to Denmark without good information, and then you have to have, I also think I believe in the state funding of political parties. I think it was already bad enough that donors having the influence they had on both our major political parties, particularly the Tory party of late. And I think you have to kind of, I mean, we can't have it that Elon Musk can pour 50, 100, $150 billion into kind of changing the terrain of public conversation in Britain uninhibitedly. So, there's more to be said. I see there's a couple of yellow hands up, so I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution changed our lives in so many positive ways, but had the climate emergency as an intense sting in the tail. And technology also changes our lives in so many positive ways. It's making this conversation possible. But I do wonder if there is a sort of digital emergency sting in the tail, and that in a few years' time, we may look back at how we've responded so far to the climate emergency as being a long, slow, and only very partially successful dress rehearsal for faster moving challenges coming in our fractured conversational environment, with the implications that might have. I'll put one last question and then we'll go to the group thereafter, which is simply, we are a community who are interested in marketing. When New Labour came to power, there was the notion of Cool Britannia and the idea that the country had somewhat lost its way, but that the creative industries and the right story could restore its cool and bring it back to life. Our problems today are quite profound, but what can the narrative creators do to support the we society? And then we'll segue and we'll begin. I think Teresa was the first to ask a question, and then we'll go on to Neil and others.
Well, I'm very happy, by the way. I mean, I'm not dashing you off at 6. I can stay for longer if you want me to.
Wonderful, thank you.
Move on to 6:15 or longer. I'm sure people want to go on for have their supper and a glass of wine, but here I am. Look, it's a very, again, another, boy, you brilliant questions, actually. I mean, I sometimes joke that one of the downsides of writing a book like this is that is that the questions it raises are so profound that actually folk like you ask them, and I'm sort of here goldfish with my mouth opening and shutting, kind of struggling to come up with good answers. Look, I mean, I I enjoy Netflix, and I've enjoyed watching on Sky Prime, The Jackal. But we need our films, our television, to be to tell stories about us. And one of the great things about the BBC, and to extent ITV, and Channel 4 less so, but is that they do that. But they're rocking. I mean, the BBC's underfunded, and the ITV's kind of under threat. I mean, Liberty Global will have to take it over, and similarly with Channel 4. The business model has been shredded by advertising being. I mean, I don't think people realize actually the extent to which our newspapers have been completely. The business model has been completely wrecked by the way in which the digital platforms insist on taking kind of huge amounts of their, sharing the content for free actually, and using that to drive advertising on their site. And literally, it's a transfer of advertising revenue from British media companies to American digital platform owners. It's amazing. And one is why the Observer has been sold to Tortoise Media, which is because the Guardian Media Group is suffering from that too. So I mean, we need a vigorous media, and we need vigorous, some bloody good novels, and you have to give people, we have to find kind of the mix of public and private funding that actually allows this to happen. I mean, at the moment, being an author and writing full time is a mug's game. I mean, you unless you have private income, you can't do it. And so, where the supply lines of actually, of creators that could kind of build narratives that are telling of the type that you describe, kind of you have to have the infrastructure, the soft infrastructure to create it. And one of the things that I'm really hoping that this Labour government does is actually, the very least, gives the BBC a decent license fee settlement, makes moves to kind of restore the business model of kind of publishers and newspapers, local radio stations alike, because if everything's on kind of Disney, Amazon Prime, Netflix, I mean, we're in real trouble. And so and then you get this question about our borders are so porous in a globalized world. I mean, what can we do to stop the tide? And I think again, one has to be extremely robust about this. In exactly the same way, I think we should do something to stop all our great companies being bought by kind of American venture capital houses and multinationals, we similarly have to be quite robust about saying, you know, there is a British story that we want to tell that actually, you know, and it's vital to our humanity and to our Britishness that it get told. So, you know, I mean, don't believe that there aren't the people who want to tell it. I mean, I got going in the media when I was in my 30s and now in my 70s. I'm absolutely sure there's just as many people around now as there were 40 years ago who'd love to kind of, you know, build a career in it. But there has to be institutions and companies with business models that are viable for careers to be allowed to be built. And that's not true at the moment.
I shouldn't hog the opportunity to put questions to you, as your answers are all really quite brilliant. You'd think that you'd written a book on all of this. Well,
I don't know. You know, you're putting me on the back foot, but let's hear from the others. Teresa.
Yeah, so Teresa.
Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting discussion. One thing we haven't talked about yet is inequality. And I saw your very optimistic article in the Observer about people be able to buy land, but it's billionaires that have got all the money who are buying up everything. And I'm very concerned that I think inequality was a very dangerous point, that I can't see people putting up with it for much longer. And I'd just like your observations on what do you think we can do about inequality and how dangerous do you think it is right now?
I chair the advisory council of a little think tank called the Fairness Foundation, and I like to frame discussions about equality in terms of fairness, partly because I think it has it kind of it gets a better hearing, but actually drives at the same kind of social evils that you're picking up in your question. I mean, first of all, I think that you're right. I think inequality of income, by the way, has kind of stabilized at very high levels. What's become dramatic is inequalities of wealth. And one of the points I make in the book is that, you know, wealth as a share of GDP has gone up from 3.5 times GDP in 1980 to over 7 times GDP in 2023 when I was writing, and yet the tax take from that has remained absolutely stable and even falling as a share of total taxes. So, you know, we whether it's council tax, whether it's residential on property, whether it's capital gains tax, whether it's inheritance tax, they've become the yield on all of them has become paltry compared with the kind of underlying wealth. And actually, part of the reason why ordinary people, you know, why tax level, I mean, it's true that, you know, taxation as a share of GDP at 38 or 39%, where it will get to in 2027, 2028, is at the low end of the EU average. But what isn't talked about is that the bulk of it is paid by income tax, value-added tax, and national insurance, which are taxes on unavoidable tax. You can't avoid those taxes on, you know, mainstream workers, and actually very little of it, much less than even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, comes from wealth. I do think you're right. I mean, house prices in London are 14 times average incomes now. That's the highest they've been since the 1880s. And of course, that high house prices and slum conditions were what really lay behind the rise of socialism in the last 20 years of the 19th century into the 20th century. Really, you know, and the ragged trousered philanthropist and the great tracts that really got people going, you know, and actually it's insupportable. It can't be the case that actually my wealth in my 70s is supported by people paying outrageous prices for the assets which kind of ultimately end up, you know, supporting mine. So it's kind of, we have to act. And I agree with you. And if you haven't come across it, there's a colleague of mine, he's a Labour Party politician actually, called Liam Byrne, has written a book on kind of the inequality of wealth. which is well worth a glance at. So look, I mean, I agree with you. Whether it's training, whether it's, and what happens in the education system, whether it's the enduring impact of class, I mean, it's always been there, but it's become more acute. And actually, no good society can carry on for long, kind of denying aspiration and obstructing mobility in the way ours does. So, look, what can I say? I do have some chapters in the book in which I try to address it. But I'm with you, Therese.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. And I like the reframing of inequality to fairness. It's much more direct language.
Well, just before we go to the next question, one of the things that they approached me to do this was in a book I wrote some years back called Them and Us. I discussed fairness, and it's even a baby, some months old, wants proportionality of response for what it considers to be, he or she considers to be a good or bad action in proportion to what they've done. And actually all civilizations going right back, to kind of, Egyptian civilization on the Nile have kind of justice has been weighed up in terms of kind of proportionality of punishment to the intensity of the crime. It's very, very fairness is an absolutely fundamental component of the human existence. And you can even see which part of the brain lights up actually when people feel things are unfair or fair. So, it's not inequality, always reduces the response. Well, you have to measure inequality, incentive, blah, blah, blah. Actually, unfairness, felt unfairness kind of is one of the most kind of distressing and painful experiences that people go through. And so you have to address it. So that's why I've recast it as fairness.
I will say the book Them and Us is still available. Its message is
God, Paul, you're well read.
Still,
it's the first 4 chapters I developed that theme.
It's still relevant, and I would say in This Time No Mistakes, one of the points that you make so powerfully on fairness is that it's not just about it's not the beneficiaries is everyone, because the cost of all of the potential Einsteins, the potential innovators, the potential entrepreneurs that don't come into being because of a lack of fairness is really holding us back as a nation. To not hold us back, let's move next to Neil.
The Lost Einsteins.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Will. Fantastic. I'm only a few chapters for your book at the moment, but I'm looking forward to getting further. My question was around purpose, actually, and the culture and identity side of it, and also Paul touched on it with I think I mentioned on one of our calls about possibly the last time I felt Britain had a sense of identity and pride in who they are at that moment of time was called Britannia and Tony Blair and all this kind of stuff. We had a pride, we had a swagger to who we are. How do we get that back? Because I believe that if we have that positivity, that sense of purpose, we can bring that forward. And just as an example, even though it's probably driven by Americans and Disney Plus, if we look at Welcome to Wrexham and the work that Ryan Reynolds and etc. have done with the football club there, they understood the mining history, they understood the culture, and there is a pride that they've brought back to that town through sport, which some people say is the new religion, that is having positive economic effect, positive effects on healthcare, all of these kind of things. How do we do that for Britain?
Oh, such good questions. I mean, if I was younger, I'd have a crack at it myself, actually. But you kind of, I mean, I'm trying to think of who's the new owner of Grimsby Football Club, who's now running for mayor in Lincolnshire, who's also done the same thing in Grimsby, actually. Used the football club to kind of create a sense of pride in the town. And someone once said that Premier League clubs play the same role in the 21st century as cathedrals did in the Middle Ages. If you have a Premier League club in your country, in your city or town, you have something that creates kind of not only jobs and opportunity, but actually kind of something to believe in. I'm sure the people in Nottingham are enjoying Nottingham Forest Run at the minute, for example. So I mean, it's kind of how do we get it back nationally? I think twofold. I think that and Boris Johnson did try to do this actually, but I mean it was all such bluster. But we have to identify things at which we're really good and which one can be proud of. I mean, I remember when I was a kid watching the two great Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary leaving the Solent for New York on a holiday on the Isle of Wight, and being very proud that my country could produce such kind of vessels, And I remember going to school as a 10-year-old, being proud of the new National Health Service. That no other country has something that was quite so comprehensive as this. You can't feel proud of our shipping fleet or our National Health Service now. And I think institutions that we need to develop and have to develop things to be proud of. I mean, one of the shaming things about what's happened in the Church of England, which, although I'm not a practicing Christian, I've always lent into. This Archbishop will be having to resign in that way. There's another institution that's kind of in terrible trouble, and the BBC, which is another great institution. I mean, the way it's dealt with kind of Hugh Edwards or and Jimmy Savile. I mean, it's a chapter of disasters in which its leadership have been kind of uncertain about what the values are of the institution, and so you end up with a kind of public that actually thinks well, they're all shit. And then you can the siren calls of a Tommy Robinson at worst, or even Nigel Farage, who's a little bit better than Tommy Robinson, get heard. So I'm kind of one of the reasons I kind of so I want to. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm kind of I ran Oxford College for 9 years of my life, and Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, they're elite in one sense, but they're lean over backwards to kind of make themselves available to kind of anyone smart enough to get through 3 years. They don't want just to be kind of, I mean, yes, it's elite in the sense that they want clever people, but they want clever from all walks of life and all classes. I mean, that institutions to be proud of. The British Army used to be an institution to be proud of. I mean, I think GSK and AstraZeneca, especially AstraZeneca with the COVID drug. But there's too few of these institutions, and too many of them show frailties. So I think if you lead one, and some of the people in this call may lead one or know people who lead one, we have to remind them of their kind of sacred obligations to kind of demonstrate through how they lead the institution that they want it to be as good as it can be. And we can't overclaim. I mean, but Boris Johnson kept claiming we're world beating this and world beating that. The evidence for us being world beating was close to non-existent. So I do think we do need politicians to try and talk up the country in the way that Johnson tried to, but to kind of do so in a measured way that's credible rather than extravagant. So it's about the tone in which we boast. It's about the credibility of the claims we make. It's about having institutions that we can be proud of. And actually, I think the way Britain is held in the world, which is often seen to be only the interests of the Foreign Office and no one else, really matters. Actually, I think that one of the reasons why Elon Musk is able to say the things that he says in recent weeks is because he knows that the country is weak, panders to America, that there's absolutely no comeback on what he's saying, and that and actually subliminally, and those of us reading his tweets are thinking, what can we do in response? And we're kind of recognizing, often without saying it, that there's so little we can do because we are so weak. And so building up the sinews of our national economic strength, and being someone and having some clout in the world, kind of has a kind of virtuous. You get on a virtuous circle loop of actually that begetting some self-regard, which permits claims to be made that become much more credible about who we are. But we have to, above all, kind of live our values and and we haven't been doing it. So there, that's my best stab at that. Another bloody good question.
A huge stab, and of course, I think it's about equivalent of 25% of our GDP going to American businesses, including some of the technology giants that are not necessarily elevating our national conversation. So these are big topics to address. Let's go to Margaret and then Roy.
Hi, Will. Thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. My question is around marketing and the government. As a marketeer, I like to be joined up in the way I do strategy and delivery of things, and that's joining up people, channels, and departments. Government departments aren't necessarily always joined up, especially in development of recent legislation, house building being a brilliant example. What do you think they can learn from marketeers?
What do I think
The government can learn from marketeers, and how can we help?
Such a good question again. Well, there's marketing and advertising, isn't there? I mean, I sometimes think that you're all marketers on the line here. I mean, I sometimes think that advertising can make extravagant claims, over the top claims, and it's often water of a duck's back, and it's kind of informational role of imparting to people kind of what's available out there to buy or use is kind of overwhelmed by trying to put the best gloss on it, and people kind of turn away from it. Where in marketing, there's kind of effort to kind of I mean, the best marketing is about getting recurrent orders for whatever good or service, because by creating an aura of reliability and trust around whatever the product is, trying to identify the need that drives the demand, to persuade that this particular company or product or service has the answer, and actually to ensure that actually people come back to buy a second, third, and fourth time, recurrent. And I think what marketers might tell government is actually don't, if you want to be believed, you have to be much more honest than you are. And sometimes you have to, I do think government kind of lacks a willingness to confront wicked issues. I mean, the recent Social Care Commission is going to report in 2028, or, repeated failings to do, to make action on a myriad of fronts. I mean, not revaluing residential property since 1991, all these wicked issues and so a marketer, I mean, I think it'd be interesting to have a conversation with, the Treasury about, how one would set about marketing the case for a more balanced and fair tax system, kind of using some of the techniques that might have worked successfully in some of the campaigns you've worked on. And sometimes you get kind of low take up. I mean, I do think pension credit is not marketed very effectively. I mean, it's almost a stigma to apply for pension credit, and it should be not seen as that. So I'm doing the best I can, but it was a question from left field, and thank you very much for it.
Apologies, but that was an absolutely brilliant answer, and I agree. It's take the big bad issues head on and be honest about them.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank you.
We were good. Right. Roy.
Hello, Will. It's a long time since we worked together, actually, in Manchester, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
Much of the conversation, and I've loved it, has been more or less internal to the UK, and speaks to weakness, a sense of lack of national pride in things which are people obvious, let me put it that way. And I want to move on from that a little bit, because it reflects what I think is a a huge current issue, and I'd like your perspective on it. And this week has been a sort of catalyst for this issue in many ways. The question is, what does short-term UK global alignment look like?
Short-term global and
alignment. I'm thinking here of an potentially immoral and unethical and unpredictable US administration, or an EU that is potentially fracturing through populism. And it's not obvious that from a position of weakness and a population which is in many degrees divided, that we can easily navigate a successful middle ground. And I would suggest that that's the biggest single issue that Keir Starmer and his people are going to have to address in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And I'm just very interested in your perspective on that issue. Thank you.
I mean, a really good question again. It was, it's quite dark at the moment, isn't it? I mean, if it was another kind of, if you transpose the events of the 1930s onto the kind of 2020s, what would be the alliance that would defeat a fascist dictator like Hitler? I mean, could you rely on Trump's America? You probably couldn't. If the battle was won, would the post-war settlement be as generous to the people who lost as the Americans were in 1945 to 50? I mean, they were incredibly enlightened times, and actually, the evaporation of all of that is I'm struggling with the right adjective, because I don't mean too apocalyptic, because while there's life, there's hope. I mean, I do think that, and I thought this for some time, that actually, as you know, I'm a pro-European, Roy, and I think that the one good thing that's emerging from Musk and Trump is that, and Musk's incredible unpopularity, is that it's forcing the issue. We're going to have to choose. And do we want to rejoin the single market or the customs union, or do we want to eat humble pie, accept this nonsense from Elon Musk, and try for some second-rate trade agreement with the United States, which will be on Trump's terms, and actually accept all the challenges to the rule of law, kind of sequestering Greenland, kind of leaving the climate change panel, and all the other things he's going to do over the next kind of couple of years. And I don't think the bulk of the electorate want to go in that direction. Even with the very Tory biased press that we have. So I think that we have to, I think, really get as close as we possibly can to the European Union. I personally think we could, I think we could win actually in a referendum on rejoining the EU, although it itself, as you said, is kind of driven by kind of populist dissension. I should say, though, that, I mean, again, you can't stand independent from the fray. I mean, that battle has to be fought, and it's much better for us to fight it within the European Union than standing outside the European Union, it seems to me. And certainly we should be in the single market and the customs union. Another problem that there is that actually, I mean, we really have screwed up in the Middle East. The wars in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, kind of supporting Israel as wholeheartedly as we have done, despite more munitions, or more ordnance has been dropped on the Gaza Strip than the Allies dropped on all the cities in Japan and Germany during the Second World War. It's incredible. The disproportionality of the response is unbelievable. And by indulging all of that and not living our values, you get a situation where the global South just thinks the West kind of is hypocritical. So, you ask for global alignment. I mean, first of all, we have to be very clear what our values are. Secondly, we have to kind of get closer to the countries that kind of share those values, which largely are in the European Union. Thirdly, we have to kind of live them and begin the long, slow process of trying to win the global South back. And fourthly, we have to do our very, very best, one way or another, to demonstrate to the kind of extreme right in America that actually, the Democratic Party and the old Republican Party, weren't wrong. America needs them back and the world needs them back. And again, I think Trump's excesses may turn off American electorate to a huge degree. I mean, of course, he should suffer condemnation for the court ruling on his sexual misdemeanors should go ahead before the inauguration day. But I suspect the Supreme Court are going to rule it out. And some of the things that he's trying to do, I think, will appall Middle America. I expect the midterms to go the way of the Democrats big time. So kind of pending that happening, we have to kind of fly the flag for the rule of law, for international institutions of collaboration, whether it be the law of the sea or climate change, and Starmer has to, and that starts with Starmer being braver about getting close to the European Union.
Yes, it's a big question as to whether he will be.
I know. I know quite well. He's
depending on him, actually. We're depending on him to live our values.
I know.
Anyway, thank you.
Well, I'll do my best.
Well, you have done your best, not just in terms of that response, but we've had a wonderful evening with you, Will. I actually met you, and you're very unlikely to remember this, but we met 25 years ago in the Oxford Union. And after you'd spoken, this must have been when you were still smoking. And you asked me if I could help you find a cigarette machine. And so we walked across to the cigarette machine, and opportunistic as I am, I took the walk to quiz you on the value at the time of the Keynesian multiplier to the UK economy, which you conceded was at the time disappointingly low. But despite the real difficulties that the world faces today, my hope is that the Huttonian multiplier effect that we can collectively create by spreading your message and the passion that you have behind it in addressing some of society's challenges will hopefully not be disappointingly low. And three opportunities we have coming up to do this. So in our next, for our members, in our next Coffee with a Cause gathering, we'll be developing a growth strategy for the preventative health social enterprise, Apt Health, and that will be on January 16th. We have our next Your Marketing Kind conversation with Dr. Chris Arnold on the importance of the S in ESG, which will be on January 23rd, Environmental and Social Governance. And on elevating our national conversation, if we have hope in the next generation to do a better job than we are currently doing, then we have a digital fireside with Lottie Jones from the News Movement on the future of the media, which will be on February 6th. So do join us for those. And for now, thank you so much, Will, for your generosity of spirit, for your open and candid answers, and for giving us so much of your time and attention this evening.
Well, I'm sorry about that. Sorry about the early mess up when I didn't. I'm delighted to do it. If you invite me again, I'll be pleased to do it. Thank you, MarketingKind. Thank you, Anna, and all the people who put it together. And thank you to for your chairman, Paul. And actually, someone said, "Is Britain a vassal state?" Read my column of go on the Guardian website, and you'll see my column of 2 weeks ago, and I wrote about Britain becoming a vassal state and what to do about it. Anyway, there we go. Look, I also enjoyed the chat. There's some very good points in the chat, so thank you for those comments too. Thank you, everybody.